faces as well as new faces. And this is another edition of our community of practice. And I just suddenly realized today that today we, I think, celebrate 3 years of this platform, which is the community of practice platform, because we started this in April 2020 when schools suddenly went into lockdown. I mean, our country went into lockdown, the whole world went into lockdown, and schools closed. So the whole idea was to come together as educators on the virtual platform to learn and support one another in that, in the deep ocean that we were all, suddenly put into, which was the virtual learning platform, right? So, and from there we've come a long way, and this community has only grown in tens and hundreds. For many of you who are probably new to this session of community of practice, a little about Adhyayan. Adhyayan Quality Education Services is a social enterprise, and I'm Jayashree Iyer. I'm a consultant with Adhyayan. I've been with Adhyayan for more than 4 years now, and I've been an educator for nearly 30 years. So, and with Adhyayan, I've been for 4.5 years, and very much during the lockdown, this community of practice, I've been kind of with this, and really proud to see that the numbers have really grown. And what Adhyayan does is, in the field of education, we really look at improvement journey for schools. We work with educators, school leaders, and all kinds of schools. We do school reviews, we do teacher professional development, we do leadership programs, and we would love to support you in any way if you need us. So please do reach out to us. And if you want to know more about what we do, please do reach out. And we would love to hear you and support you for as much as possible, because we believe that we all learn from one another. And that is how the community of practice also started. And we've been on this platform finding out what are the current needs for educators and for schools, and bringing in thought leaders and other educators to kind of talk on those issues so that we learn from one another. So today we have Mr. Vishnu Karthik, and we are going to be hearing about mind, brain, and education. So without wasting much time, let me introduce Vishnu to you. Vishnu is currently the CEO of Experiential Learning Systems at the Heritage Group of Schools, which is a group of K-12 experiential learning schools. Apart from being on the board of the Heritage Schools, he's also responsible for strategic projects for the group, including new campus initiatives, curriculum development, instructional leadership, continuous school improvement, and technology integration. He has also co-founded and led startup school teams for setting up new campuses, including a top-ranked international school, 2 CBSE schools, and an early years school. In his prior roles with the Heritage, he has been a head of school, a grade 9 economics teacher, and of course, he's also very much an outdoor person. He loves trekking, and he's also a trekking instructor. He is a proponent of experiential learning, and he has visited over 50 experiential and deeper learning schools worldwide. Among his other administrative responsibilities, he's keenly interested in building professional learning communities, instructional leadership, cognitive neuroscience, education technology, leadership coaching, authentic assessments, and deeper learning curriculum. He's also been in the corporate before joining the education field, and he's been with Accenture, Right Management in the areas of leadership development, organization change management, learning design, and he has delivered a number of projects in India as well as abroad. And he's also co-authored some books. He's into yoga. He's a yoga practitioner. He also is a Vedanta. So a lot there with Vishnu, doing a lot of stuff there. So I now hand over to Vishnu. And Vishnu, we are really eager to hear from you about your about neuroscience and how it really helps educators, and why, as teachers, we need to know how the brain develops. Yeah. So how is that going to help us in our classroom? Over to you, Vishnu.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. Thank you for a very generous introduction. I know it's a little longer than what we had expected, but really honored to be on this platform. I've personally learned so much from Adhyayan over the last decade or so. In fact, that's the first time I got introduced to their work. I've also been an accreditor. I've also gone through several of the initiatives. I'm also really happy to be back with Jayashree. Jayashree also is a dear colleague. I don't know if she mentioned in her own introduction that she spent many, many years in Heritage, and Heritage is where it is today thanks to education leaders like Jayashree. I also see some of my ex-colleagues in the platform, so really happy to see many of you online. One quick disclaimer, this session, I was just telling Jayashree when we were doing a quick trial run, that this session is actually designed as a full credit course for educators. I designed this about almost 9-10 years back. That's the first time this module is designed. This is designed as a 30-hour course. It's a full credit course that I am a teacher. That's where we started. And a couple of other B.Ed programs, we started launching it. But over the period of time, this is getting crunched, and finally Adhyayan forced me to do it in under 50 minutes. So I really don't know whether I'm going to do justice to the original learning objectives of this course. But nevertheless, my attempt is to touch upon some big ideas from the field of cognitive neuroscience, and how does it impact our lives as educators, and also how our children learn in learning context. So I'm not going to delay much. I really wish this was an in-person workshop, because when we do this workshop in person, there's a lot of back and forth in terms of questions, queries, because it's such an exciting topic for many of us. But unfortunately, given the time constraint, and it's also a Saturday evening, I know a lot of us have family waiting, including my own daughter. So I promise to finish this on time, and of course, we'll also have some time at the end for some Q&A. Before I start, I just want to quickly check. I would like you to respond to this prompt question on the screen, which says, "What do I think I know about the brain?" Right. I would like you to respond on the chat box. You can just open the chat box and enter it. Just a couple of words, it's just a sentence. This will give me a sense of where the audience is, because I've never met most of you, at least. I really don't know where your level of learning with respect to the brain is. So I'm not asking you, what do you know about the brain? I'm asking you, what do you think you know about the brain? There's a big difference between these two questions. Just about 10 seconds, not more. Just if you can just enter your responses. Control center, perception, learning ability in the most during the first 8 years. Plastic, I would imagine what Pramila is referring to is plasticity,
Yes.
its capacity to change. Thinking machine, central processing unit. Yes, a lot of us actually view the brain from the visual metaphor of a computer. And we will continue using that metaphor. It's not actually a bad metaphor, but we'll talk about that more. Decision-making center, little known part of the body. Expanse of thoughts, of course. Yes, all our thoughts. Come to think of it, the entire creation, entire puzzle, and all our lives is just nothing but chemicals firing in the small piece into the in our heads. When not used, it shrinks. Okay, let's talk about that more in the later part. Center of our body. Yeah, 5 more seconds. We want to just add differently set for each person. Yes, it's very unique for each person. Stores of information, controls emotions, something we can sharpen. Okay. I also know, I'm not disagreeing with the sentence, something we can sharpen, but I just want us to reflect upon, why do we use these words like sharpen for a brain? Why can't we use the word like broaden or deepen? Why use the word sharpen? It's not a bad word. I agree with it. But I'm just provocating the audience to actually question some of the words we use to describe. In some sense, these are metaphors in our own head to understand the phenomena around us, and kind of influences our behavior. Like sharpen would mean that I'm going to make it more and more precise, more and more perfect. But is brain really a machine that can be perfected in that sense? Can it be made sharp? Just as a question for us to think about. Nourish is a good question. Okay. Now I'm going to go to the next question. What do you want to know about the brain? Now that you've talked about what do you think you know about the brain, I would like you to enter in the chat box. What do you want to know about the brain? Again, I'm going to the chat box. You can just enter in the chat box itself. I don't think there's a Q&A box here, but okay. Latest research on brain development, how it functions, how we can optimally use the unused part of the brain. Okay, are we going to talk about this? Is there an unused part of the brain? How much is unused, etc. How it responds? How does it work? How can we control according to our needs and wants? Again, a good question. How do we control the brain? Some assimilation of concept. Why is it different for different? Oh, it's a great question. Assimilation. I really like the way you phrased it. Assimilation of concepts. How do we rather than controlling it our body to help design thinking and optimize? Okay, great. So I think this kind of gives me a broad. What will AI do to our brain? Great question again. I hope we'll start talking about it too. How reading stories activate brain. We'll talk about that as well. You can also see the picture of this of Amir Khan from the movie Gajni. How many of you have actually seen the movie? Quick show of hands. Okay, some of you have, some of you haven't. It's actually, if you haven't, I wouldn't encourage you to watch it, but it's one of the very popular movies which came many years back. It's actually the original was a movie in Tamil, and I was in college when this movie came, and I actually saw the movie in Tamil. I was pretty excited and curious also that how is that one person who's subjected to a trauma in the brain have very limited functionality with respects to memory. Okay, so I have one promise I have is that at the last slide of the session, I'm going to talk about the real life Gajni. Does it really happen in life that if we keep seeing in Bollywood movies or Indian movies that when somebody gets hurt, they have a memory lapse, or in some cases they kind of weird memory like Gajni, he had to kept writing something on his body to keep remembering, but he still remembered many other things of his girlfriend being hurt, about the villains and things like that, right? But there's also based on an English movie called Memento, which is a very powerful. I would recommend you watch that movie. I think it's a little more scientific than the Indian version in it. But if you stay till the end, I will share the real life Gajini to you and a very interesting impact it has had on the development of brain science itself, right? That's like you to know that very interesting aspect of brain research which happened, something very similar to what happened to Gajni in real life. Okay, there's something wrong with my, okay, now I can see it. Yeah. So one thing I just wanted to know when I saw the comments, like one of the comments was that we want to make it the brain use fully. How many of you actually have heard this statement that we only use 10% of a brain? Quick show of hand. Like, my dad, of course, all fathers often tell their sons that can you please start using 90% of the brain? But it's a general myth, not just in India. I've realized around the world that there is this thing that we use only 10% of the brain and 90% is untapped. I think it largely comes from some supposedly brain analysis of Einstein, closer home, C.V. Raman, for example, J.C. Bose, for example, or some scientists, and they say, oh, their brains have not been used fully. And look at how they have functioned. So the point I'm trying to make is that in the last 20, 30 years, we got to recognize a lot of what we know of the brain, actually, a lot of it is just myth. Much of it is not true. For example, this statement that we use only 10% of the brain actually is not true at all. We use all parts of the brain, even the most intellectually, for lack of a better word, intellectually low in the spectrum. Let's say if you do an assessment test on IQ, which is a very narrow definition of understanding of brain. But assuming if you do that and somebody performs so really well, even that person actually uses 100% of the brain. So there's nobody in this world who uses actually less than 100% of the brain. Always people use all parts of it. Second myth, which is there, is around there, is left and right brain, for example. The people say that some people are left brain oriented, some people are right brain oriented. There is no bigger falsehood than that statement. There is nothing called left brain and right brain. When I first heard it, I had a shock of my life because for 10 years, I always thought, oh, these people are left brain, these were right brain, I'm a left brain, I'm a right brain. So I used to have these judgments or frameworks to fit people's thinking capacity or their orientations. But it turns out there's nothing called left and right brain. It's not nothing like left brain people are more logical, analytical, and right brain are creative, etc. There's nothing of that sort. They're all the same. Creative people use the left side of the brain, and logical people use the right side of the brain. So there's nothing of that sort. There are left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Those are just the physical way in which the brain is designed, but it's got nothing to do with logic, creative, etc. Creative people use all parts of the brain, so do logical people in that sense. So like there are a lot of myths which has existed. So one rule or one expectation I would have all educators to at least be aware of some of this called neuromyths, which still persists even 20, 30 years after research has told us it's not true. Like some of these statements you can see here, which says that why right brain is half-witted or misapplication of neuroscience. Actually, that doesn't exist. Another thing about girl brain and boy brain, the brains of boys and girls are different. There is some truth to it because biologically they are different, but doesn't mean that the output is very different. So the statement like girls are better at creative work and boys are better at directions, it simply is not true. There's nothing in the brain research that tells you that women are better in so and so things and men are better in something else. In fact, one of my professors at Harvard University, Elizabeth Speckle, had done this work on mathematics and the human brain. And she had done some extraordinary longitudinal work to tell us that the myth that men are better at math and women aren't is not founded on brain science. The reason why you find more engineers, for example, and you find more engineers among men than among women, there's nothing to do with the brains, but it's just got to do with the social expectations. That in some way you orient people to take certain preferences, but no women or men are biased towards anything. Even things like pink and blue, often we say girls like pink and boys like blue. For many years, people used to think it's got to do with the way the brain is structured. But now research tells you it doesn't make sense. There is nothing in the brain which tells you that women should like pink or girls should like pink and boys should like blue. Although you'll find most boys liking blue and you'll find most girls in the generation, including my own daughter, liking pink. But the reason it's got nothing to do with the brain, but it's got to do with the social reinforcements children experience. Because every time my daughter sees, let's say, a television serial or she reads a book, these stereotypes are reinforced through literature, for example. In fact, even till the World War II, the color of most toys for girls was actually green. It was not pink. But it so happened that during World War II, they had to manufacture a lot of uniforms. So the green color was in demand. And all of the green color pigment available in the market was taken to the war effort. So what was left for manufacturers during the war times was pink, which was cheaper. So essentially, all the toys manufacturers used pink just to save cost. But it just so happened over a period of time post-war that habit stuck on. And eventually people just thought girls like pink because the brains were designed that way. Actually, it is not true. So this is Leslie Hart made this very popular professor. She made this argument, one of the earliest cognitive neuroscientists. She said, designing educational experiences without an understanding of the brain is like designing a glove without an understanding of the human hand. It's actually quite tragic that we have spent over the last 5 decades designing learning experience in the classroom, designing curriculum, designing schools with very little understanding of how the brain learns. And that is probably the reason a lot of the traditional learning methodologies really doesn't sync with children, and most children get disenfranchised or they lose engagement, or even worse, they actually just lose what they have learned after a period of time beyond the examination because it's not synchronized or it's not in harmony with the way brain is designed by nature. I'm not going to bore with you a lot of around the structure of what neuroscience is, but broadly, you need to understand, any educator needs to understand three things. And I'm focusing on the column on my right on the screen. I think first is education, which is in the top circle, which is around, the pedagogical sciences, the art and craft of teaching. The second is neuroscience. It's exceptionally important for educators to understand how is the brain designed biologically. How does the brain learn? How does the brain grow? How does the brain die? How does the brain network? All of these things. And the third is psychology, which is around emotions. The intersection of pedagogy, neuroscience, and psychology is what makes a comprehensive understanding of how teaching and learning happens. Okay, so that's the broad context. I'm now going to go briefly into the structure of the brains. Remember, the original course was about 30 hours. So I used to spend a lot of time in the structure of the brain, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give you simple frameworks for you to understand how physically the brain is structured. Yeah. And it's a very simplistic framework, if I would say. One, I want us to understand brain is a very soft-headed organ, right? It's within a skull. It's exceptionally soft. In fact, if you, I know it is crude, but if you had the ill fortune of watching an accident on the road, which I have a couple of times, when there is serious head injury, you can actually see if the skull is cracked. You can actually see the brain oozing out because it's like a jelly. It's literally like a jelly, and if you shake it further, it can just ooze out. It is that fragile, and that is why it is masked in the skull, because the skull is harder. One might argue, why is the brain designed so soft? Why can't it be made hard? The reason is that it allows the brain to expand and adapt. If it had been a hard thing like the bone or the heart or your intestines, it can't adapt the way it is adapting right now. Evolution wouldn't have happened the way it has happened right now. So we are learning machines because the brain is soft jellied, right? It's a trade-off. Nature had to take a call. Do I want learning machines with soft heads, or do I want non-learning machines but with really safe heads? So the compromise between safety and learning, nature chose learning with some safety measures like a skull around it, right? It's also very interesting. The brain actually doesn't touch the skull because if it touches, you get something called migraines or headaches. In fact, all the headaches is nothing but the brain actually touching the skull, and it sends you pain signals, say something is really wrong. So there is always fluids between the skull and the brain and keeps it soft. Again, you would ask, why would it do that? Why can't brain get used to touching the skull? The answer is that if you fall down or you bang against a wall or a glass, etc., the brain should not get impacted. The neuron should not get hurt. So it's in a fluid where there is some shock absorption available. So if you think of it, it's a brilliant design, designed to keep the brain safer. Right? We also don't have the biggest brains. If you look at all the species in this world, we don't have the biggest brains. Of course, whales and elephants have bigger brains, but really doesn't matter. What really matters is the ratio of the brain size and the body size. That's what makes the difference. So with the ratio of the brain size and the body size, we have one of the highest among the species here. I think the next in line, which actually comes really close, is dolphins. In fact, dolphins are very, very evolved species. In fact, a lot of anthropologists say that if humans had not been in this world, this planet, dolphins probably in a million years would have dominated the food chain and not the humans. Next is, of course, our squirrels. Squirrels are exceptionally adaptable. An interesting species which people don't think of as intelligent animals, but they're extraordinarily intelligent, is actually crows. Crows also have a great ratio between body weight and their this one. In fact, crows can actually solve up to 7 to 8 levels of puzzles to get a morsel of food, and they're amazing problem solvers. That's possibly a reason you'll find crow in every part of the world, and they've literally not changed much for many, many, many years. They've not evolved because they're hardcore survivors. The picture on the right, which is the black image with wires around, that is how brain actually is if you peep into it. Of course, not this graphical artistic representation. But the idea is that brain is nothing but neurons connected with other neurons. There's nothing but networks of neurons in it, and each network of neuron actually sends signals to another one. And when they send signals is when you have memory, emotions, everything which you do in your life is nothing but this. In fact, it is quite fascinating that all the color which you see in this world, all the beauty you experience in this world, uh, all the beautiful music you hear, all the lovely emotions you experience, all the joy which you have in your life, everything, all the beautiful cosmos you see, is all out there, is nothing but is inside a dark jelly. It's unfortunate. The brain itself is so dark, you really can't see. But you are fortunate to use the brain to see everything outside in the form of chemicals, right? There are three distinct phases the way brain evolves. The first rapid phase of growth is actually when the child is born till around the time of age 6 or 7, right? In fact, 90% of the brain is physically developed by age 6, right? I want you to remember this. 90% of the physical brain is developed by age 6. So if you want to have maximum impact on your children through the lifetime of that individual, you have to do work before age 6 or 7, right? So early education, primary education interventions has a significant impact. In fact, governments around the world are now shifting their budgetary spend within education to early years and primary care rather than higher education, because a lot of the brain's health and eventually psychological emotional health actually happens in before age 6. The second phase of growth, I said 90% of growth happens. The balance, about 10% growth, actually happens between age 6 and around puberty-ish. Not exactly, but around puberty-ish. In fact, for girls, the brain actually evolves much earlier, matures much earlier. Uh, and we all know that out of experience as well. Biologically, women do experience maturity much earlier. And puberty is a critical milestone in the development of brain, and also in development of a lot of learning goals. Like for example, language. The window to learn language is actually up till puberty, because post puberty it gets very difficult for the brain to learn language. Not that it's impossible; it is possible, but it is exceptionally difficult. Right? Even if you learn a language post puberty, your capacity to master grammar and pronunciation is fairly compromised if you learn post puberty. And that is why some people, including myself, for example, have a strong South Indian accent. The reason is I probably learned English post my puberty. My Hindi is very South Indianish. Why? Because I learned Hindi post puberty. Had I been exposed to Hindi early on in my life, I would probably be speaking like a proper Delhiite or a North Indian would be speaking. So, like Japanese, for example, just can't say words like ra and la, for simple reason they're not exposed to these words before puberty, and they learn English post puberty, and they can't do it. So puberty is one marker till the balance 10% to grow. For boys, the second phase of growth actually extends up to 23, 24, in some cases even 31, 32. And that is why many men are actually physically late bloomers. Of course, a lot of the women in this room say, of course, I knew when I got married to my husband, I knew he's just not matured enough to manage me or to, work with me or to live a life with me. That is so true. I'm not saying this as a stereotypical gender joke. Physically, men mature much, their brains mature much late. In fact, for many men, unfortunately or fortunately, their brains develop even up till 31, 32. Like I would always imagine that, I actually became a little more mature only in my early 30s and not in my 20s, etc. Maybe I was a classic case of a late bloomer, and a lot of men are, right? The third phase of third phase of the brain, men or women, growth is actually around old age. That is when the brain starts winding down. Okay. Uh, if you would ask me, okay, Vishnu, you gave us age markers for the first two phases. One is age 6, second is around 20-ish or around puberty if it's a women. For what is the age for the third phase? Good news is there's no age for the third phase. Good news is, of course, the brain will wind down, But if you do the right things through your life, you can delay this third phase of winding down indefinitely. I'll talk about what you could do to actually delay this further. But the third phase of winding down, and the brain does wind down naturally, it starts winding down to conserve energy. It starts killing memory. It starts killing some of the functions you had before. So you start becoming slow. You start becoming very taking time to respond. You'll start forgetting things, etc. But there is no age marker for this. There are many people biologically can avoid this phase or delay this phase indefinitely. Now, the three parts of the brain, there is something called hippocampus. That is where the short-term hippocampus essentially means it looks like a seahorse. That's where the short-term memory is stored. It is also the memory powerhouse. All memory which you know actually gets stored through the hippocampus. Remember, we talked about Gajini, the Amir Khan movie. Gajini can't remember any information and he has to write down on his body, right? What actually happened to Gajini is hippocampus got damaged. If the hippocampus goes off, you can't encode new memory, but it will not impact old memory. So which means if my hippocampus gets damaged now, I will remember whatever is there in the past. I'll remember my family. I'll probably remember this workshop because I've done this in the past, etc. But I can't learn anything new, right? So that's a very important part for children in classrooms, the hippocampus. And we'll talk about how do we improve the performance of the hippocampus. The second is amygdala. Amygdala sits right next to hippocampus for some strange reason. We really don't know why, but it sits right next to it. Amygdala is the emotional response house. All your emotions, good or bad, joy or sorrow, fear or excitement, all of it gets processed near amygdala, and amygdala is connected to hippocampus. That's one of the reasons emotions actually play the biggest role in memory formation. So we know anecdotally as educators that children can't learn when they are emotionally stressed. Biologically, science has proven us that the reason is amygdala sits right next to the memory formation center, which is hippocampus. And if this is getting impacted, it won't allow hippocampus to function. I'll talk more about it a little later. And the third is prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain, right? Now, this is the brain which actually makes us human in some sense. Most mammals actually don't have a prefrontal cortex. And even if they have, like the chimpanzees or our closest relatives from the ape family, they would have a prefrontal cortex, but it is not as evolved the way it is here because prefrontal cortex regulates thoughts, emotion, and any executive actions. Anything is discretion, control, all comes from prefrontal cortex, right? Now, the funny thing is that if amygdala, which is the center which processes fear, if it experiences elevated fear, it actually impacts the development of prefrontal cortex. I want you to know that, right? It just it kind of impairs the growth of the frontal cortex. So that's the children who experience stress early on in their lives. They really have very poor decision-making skills later on. They end up taking wrong calls. They end up taking too much risk. They take debt. They take a lot of credit card loans. They can't be steady with their families. Their divorce rates are higher. They can't stick to jobs. There are some individuals do it. Much part of it is also because they have probably experienced a lot of stress when they're young and amygdala impacting prefrontal cortex. I'll talk more about this a little later. Another way to look at the brain, I mean, I'm sharing simple frameworks for you to understand the brain. One way is about the phase in which brain grows. Another way to the different parts of the brain, the three parts of the brain with the hippocampus, amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. The third very interesting way to look at the brain, our human brain is actually three brains put together. That's another way to look at it. Three brains put together. And these are very simple ways for you to remember it even after this session. And that's the whole intent of sharing these in these simple frameworks. The first brain is the reptilian brain, which is the oldest part of the brain. It has been there for 65 million years since the time of the dinosaurs, right? This reptilian brain essentially is the brain which is connected right above the end of the spinal cord, and that's where it ends. In fact, we look at a lot of reptiles, you actually don't have a big brain. They only have the spine and a small bulb over it, and that's the reptilian brain. What does the reptilian brain do? Anything which it does in instinct, is a reptilian brain. It doesn't require any emotions. Like, for example, if I come and slap you, and I wouldn't, but this is hypothetically, you have a reflex. You will shift your head, you'll close your eyes, etc. Right? How does that happen? It is all because of reptilian brain. You can't control the reptilian brain. The body automates it. Your heart rate, your breathing, your pulse rate, all of your sleep, your balance, all is managed by the reptilian brain, and you don't have control over it because nature doesn't want you to kill yourself or damage yourself. So it's not given the control to you. It's autopilot, right? Like, example, you can't kill yourself by closing your nose and your mouth and stop breathing. You can't. The reptilian brain will kick in to keep you alive. It's very interesting, right? Uh, Reptiles only have a reptilian brain, and that's why reptiles cannot exhibit emotions, unlike humans or mammals, right? Very interesting. I often give this example, which fascinated me. I was just watching this documentary on king cobras. I come from Chennai, and Chennai has one of the largest snake labs in it. And over there, they're displaying a documentary. And one of the things they said was that a king cobra, or any snake for that matter, but it's more so in a king cobra's case, when they lay the eggs, they protect the eggs instinctively, that they want to protect it. And the poison levels which they have during the time of protection of their eggs is the highest. They almost have 10x more poison than normally they would have. But just a few hours before the eggs are going to be hatched, the king cobra will just move away. It will not care, it will not look back at the eggs, right? You often wonder the king, and it happens with turtles, for example. They lay the eggs on the beaches, they guard it for many months, but before they hatch, they will go into the sea and they will not look back at the this one. You wonder why. The reason is the reptilian brains cannot process emotions. So when a snake egg hatches, the king cobra will have an instinct to eat the baby in itself. So to prevent the baby from being killed by its by the mother will go out. So that's how reptilian brain works. They don't have the mammalian brain which can exhibit love, compassion. So mammals have a better sense of emotion, relationships. They take care of the next generations. Like elephants, for example, can actually not just take care of the young ones, they can also take care of the old ones, for example. They grieve death. They can recognize uncles and aunts. They have relationships of first cousins, uncles, aunts. And if uncle dies, it comes. In fact, elephants can also observe anniversaries. So some of these mammals have very evolved mammalian brains, right? The third is the human brain, which evolved only about 2 million years back. It's a very recent phenomenon in the growth of brain. It's only about 2 million years back, and more so, it has come in the species Homo sapiens, and also Homo erectus, Homo deus, a lot of other species who come from the Homo family. They have prefrontal cortex, which is the human brain, which can think complex things like language, music, etc. In fact, I would love to go more deep into what actually makes human brain very different. How does the humans can recognize music and dogs can't? How do humans can develop language but other animals can't? Other than basic code, which most animals would do, they don't have complex language systems the way we do. How does that happen? But we really don't have time. But probably we'll talk about some other day. Now I'm getting into the core of my conversation, which is what are the 5 neuro principles for every school? Okay. This is based on brain science. The key takeaways which I would like to remember, that what are the key 5 things which every teacher, school educator should know based on brain research. What has brain research told us? I think the first thing the brain science has told us is knowledge is always constructed. It is never learned, right? Many educators know this intuitively, but when you look at brain scans, you also realize that brains are not designed to memorize. Brains are not designed to learn in vacuum. Knowledge is always constructed. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is the way the neurons function, right? By the way, this I've copied from the Understand UBD by Jay McTighe. He didn't use brain research to put this together, but he actually wrote a book later comparing the understanding by design framework and brain research. And I've lifted this from this for better understanding as curriculum designers and as instruction leaders, that what happens is when you acquire a knowledge, what the brain does is it actually creates neurons. But when it creates neurons, it has to connect with existing neurons. It cannot stand on its own. So whatever you're hearing right now, if it doesn't connect with your past information, past neurons which is already there in the brain, it will not stay. It will die by the time you go to sleep and wake up tomorrow morning. So when any knowledge is acquired, essentially what the brain does is it creates neuron networks based on existing neurons. How do they make based on existing neuron? Essentially, you make meaning out of it, right? And then when you make meaning out of it, then you expand those neuron networks and you apply this existing neuron network to something else. I'll give a very crude example of this. Okay. Now, don't judge me, but I'm just using a simple example. One of my favorite actresses, hypothetically, it's not the case, but hypothetically, one of my favorite actors could be, my favorite actress could be Priyanka Chopra, for example, right? One would argue, why do I like Priyanka Chopra? I mean, there is no reason why would I like Priyanka Chopra as against Deepika Padukone, right? But from a brain science perspective, there is a high possibility. The reason I like Priyanka Chopra is maybe when I look at Priyanka Chopra, I am reminded of maybe a classmate or a crush I had in my grade 2 in my primary school. And those neuron memories, the neural network memories of that girl is already there in my brain. And when I see Priyanka Chopra in a movie, I don't know if she acted in Pathan or whatever that movie is, when I see her on a big screen, those neurons activate my existing set of neurons. And when they make that connection, then I realize, oh, I love Priyanka Chopra. I don't know why, but I just like her. But at the brain level, all that has happened is these new neurons have actually caught on to existing neurons, and these existing neurons are given strength, life, energy to the new neurons, right? And then with these new neurons strengthened, wherever I see Priyanka Chopra in a new movie or this one, I start liking her more and more. I start admiring her acting. I start watching more of her this one. So the network gets stronger and stronger, and I start making meaning for anything which I see Priyanka Chopra. So she's so good. She's doing that. So bottom line is, whatever I like is based on some neural network which is already there. That's true of any new knowledge also. If you have to learn something, let's say about, let's say the photosynthesis, there should be some existing neurons about plants, about sunlight, etc. When I learn about photosynthesis, this actually latches on to the old networks, and then it gets stronger and stronger. And once it gets stronger, I can use this expanded network to understand other higher advanced concepts, etc. But the problem is many times in traditional teaching, you really don't leverage on past memory. You really don't leverage on past knowledge. I think Jayashree would know, in all project-based learning schools, one of the things which any good project-based learning school would do is called BBK, building background knowledge, right? Why did they do that? Because I also did something on audience analysis. For example, I asked you to think about what do you know about the school. Why? I'm trying to activate your past neurons. And once I understand what your past neurons are, I can moderate my design so that I latch onto your existing neurons. So I just wanted to understand this. The learning is always constructed. So as educators, you always should go back to the old memory. All long-term memory is formed through the hippocampus, which is a short-term memory. Once a short-term memory processes it, it looks at the existing neurons. Once it's existing neurons, it goes to the prefrontal cortex and just gets registered as long-term memory in itself, right? It is like a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, if there is a jigsaw puzzle, if a new piece of puzzle comes in, it can't stand alone in thin air. It has to fit in somewhere. So a good educator will always try to find fitment with past knowledge so the children can construct their own knowledge, their own jigsaw puzzle. If a child is not able to fit in that new piece of information into the existing jigsaw puzzle, that piece of information will die out when the child sleeps. In fact, every time you go to bed and you wake up, the brain does something called cleaning. It's called REM, rapid eye movement. When you dream, Your dream state is nothing but cleaning state. That's why it's a very important place for us to have good sleep. I'll talk about that a little later. But from a memory perspective, sleep is a time, the dream state, especially in that sleep, is a time where it actually cleans what is required, what is not required, right? And if any jigsaw puzzle is not fitting into something, it will disappear and you won't remember tomorrow. Even if you remember it tomorrow, the next time you sleep, it again disappear in it. Yeah. So what are the takeaways for educators? The takeaway for educators is that always remember brain is like a memory velcro. So velcro is, you remember, you need some base for it to stick and take it out, right? So learning is never dispensed, it is self-discovered. We talk about constructivism in education. It is so true. Brain research has confirmed it, that constructivism is the only way children or adults learn. So how do you construct understanding? There are some of the pedagogical tools is mental manipulation, metacognition, asking kids to reflect upon. BBK is one thing, building background knowledge. So every time you start a concept, always spend time trying to help children understand what they know about this concept before, right? Uh, Expand relational circuits, for example, multiple assessments. So when you do multiple assessments, you also strengthen the networks. Let's say you form a new network on hyper photosynthesis. If you're doing multiple assessments, typically it happens through a project, right? You're able to reinforce the same network again and again and again. So the network then thinks, hey, this is important. And hence, I won't forget this, right? Performance task, like, in project-based learning schools. And that's why I always feel project-based learning school is the closest you could have based on brain research science, because it kind of reinforces a lot of the way the brain naturally learns. Performance tasks are nothing but that your assessment is not a test or a exam, but an actual task to display your understanding, knowledge, and the skills you have gained, right? When you do that, you're also reinforcing some of these neural networks and making them stick together. In fact, there's some of the images actually an image of a learning map of a concept over a period of time of children, and look at that, they've not really forgotten a certain concept, they've really stuck to it, and you can see the networks getting thicker and thicker with time. So that's a very important thing to remember, right? Remember, brain is not something in the head. Okay, what is there in the head is only one part of the brain. The brain is actually the entire central nervous system, including your spinal cord and your peripheral nerves and peripheral nervous system, which is there in your hands and legs, etc. So learning by doing is actually very, very effective, because your nerve ends of your brains are there in your hands. It's there in your palms, it's there in your feet, it's there in your gut, for example. All of it is a brain. So this metaphor, which remember we talked about metaphors and how it drives behaviors. One of the wrong metaphors we have is the brain is a head thing. So we view learning as very cerebral, that you memorize things because everything is in the head, right? Actually, no, brain is not in the head. Brain is there all over your body. The main hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex is there in the head. But the rest of the sensors of the brain is there all over your body. If you want your brain to learn, then don't engage the head, engage the whole body, right? So that's another one thing. The second takeaway, which I would like you to remember based on brain research, is the relationship between stress and learning. We know anecdotally that stress and learning are exceptionally connected, but brain research has actually highlighted that it is a very thick connection between learning. In fact, the biggest impact of learning effectiveness is the emotional moods of the learner, right? I think I showed this image earlier of the three important things: amygdala, hippocampus, and even cerebellum. Cerebellum is the part which is right outside the stem. Now, all these things are very important for learning process. Now, what happens is every time an input or an emotion comes in, it actually goes through the cerebellum, which is the tip of the spine, which enters the brain. The signal enters the brain. Think of it as if you go to Hindu temples or Jain temples or Buddhist temples, you'd find the gatekeepers, the Dwarapalakas. In a Vishnu temple, you call it Jaya and Vijaya. They actually are the guardians of the temple. They essentially are supposed to check every devotee who's entering the temple. Okay, I mean, that's the metaphorical idea behind it. That happens in our brain too. The cerebellum actually assesses every piece of information which goes into your brain, and it goes through this, right? Even through the eye, it actually goes to the cerebellum and goes up. Now, when it goes up, it actually says, hey, is this signal good or bad. Okay, remember one thing I forgot to mention, our brain still thinks that we're all nomads living in the savannas of Africa. It doesn't know we're sitting in Delhi, Bombay, Gurgaon before a computer. We are still thinking that our brain is still designed right now to live in forest. It still think there are snakes, lions, tigers outside. It still think that anytime you can die. It still think that anytime you can have a famine. Why do you think we love sugar? Think about it. We love sugar because nature still thinks that tomorrow there'll be a famine and you will die because of lack of calories. And that's why this obsession with sugar is there. Of course, we have not been able to moderate some of these natural impulses. In today's age and time, there is an abundance of calories. Similarly, the brain also thinks that you are in Africa, that you are going to get killed anytime. So that is why it keeps checking every input comes in. If any input enters your cerebellum, the sensory thalamus, which is there, if there's anything negative, anything fearful, okay, it immediately dispatches two signals. Okay, let me go behind. By the way, it's very important to understand the simple mechanics. It's not complex, but if you understand this, you can find answers to many things how your children respond. So any normal signal that comes to cerebellum, it goes straight to your sensory cortex, which is your prefrontal cortex, to process. Let's say you hear this conversation, you hear interesting information about the brain. The cerebellum think, okay, it's a safe information, it's an important information. It sends it to prefrontal cortex to be encoded as short-term memory or long-term memory based on how you decide, right? Based on how you're engaged, and a lot of other factors are there. But let's say I am passing a judgment on one of you. I am bullying you in this conversation. I am trying to pass some snide remarks. I'm trying to be, negative, right? That information suddenly is scary. There is a negative information in it, or in at that point, what happens is the sensory thalamus, which is near the cerebellum, it says, "Oh my God, this information looks very scary, looks negative. Let me send it to the prefrontal cortex, like the way I'm sending every information, but let me also send it to the amygdala, which is the emotional response center, just to be safe. What if there's a tiger which is going to come, and what if this Vishnu is going to pounce from this laptop and probably crush my ego, not physically, but that fear is there, right? Because remember, we are still cavemen or women in Africa, right? Now it goes to amygdala, and the amygdala then says, "Oh my God, there is a negative thing." It shuts down everything in the brain because it's now experiencing negative emotions. It now gets into fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? That's the only three responses amygdala will do when it has a negative emotion, right? When somebody is bullied, like in this case, if I bully you, your cerebellum will then say, "Oh, it's a negative emotion." It'll tell the amygdala. Amygdala will then choose one of the three options: fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. Fight is, of course, if you see a tiger, you want to fight, or you want to run away from the tiger, or you just stand there for the tiger to do what it has to, and you pray that it'll go away. So these are only three responses you can get in it. But when it does it, it shuts down every other organ, including memory formation, digestion, etc. And that is why when children experience fear, they can't learn. They'll be sitting in the class because they are in the freeze syndrome. They can't fight with you. They can't flight, run away. Some of them do. Like I have run away from classrooms. But most children, what do they just freeze? Freeze not in the sense of physical sense, but the brain stops taking any information. They will be sitting in the classroom and they can't process it. The most scary part is that if the brain is experiencing continuous negative information or negative or stress, we call it chronic stress, then the brain becomes makes the amygdala permanently in a fight, flight, or a freeze syndrome. It's a permanent damage. In fact, I have one image. Look at this. This is an actual image of an unfortunate individual and a healthy individual. You can see the individual on the left are healthy brain, and into the right have gone through toxic stress. This, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is a scan of a child in an orphanage who didn't have parents, who didn't have access to good food, good care. There are issues of bullying, and this picture is taken in their adult life. Okay, you can actually see the lobes have disappeared because the brain goes in the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. It cuts nutrition to the brain, and it permanently impacts the size of the brain. Physically, the brains are smaller for children who've gone through this one. And that's why, when in India, especially in a country like ours, when there is high inequity and high poverty, you often find many people who are in our lives, who are drivers, are people who work at our homes, for example. Many times you feel, oh, I've told you 10 times, you can't even follow this. I want you to think for a minute that many of them may not have had good nutrition, good access to good food, good health, safe learning spaces, safe homes. And often what happens, a lot of their brain just gets permanently impoverished. Permanently. You really can't do much about it. And their cognitive capacities are permanently compromised. And I just want us to think that many children do go through this, and in adult life have a little empathy. When you find them to be a little slow in thinking, etc., know this research that most likely many of them would have gone through some compromised learning activities. In fact, one of the things I want you to think about is that when you watch a horror movie or a psychological thriller, a murder mystery in a movie theater or at the comfort of your homes, do you realize that you're watching the movie in the comfort of your home with your loved ones next to you? You still feel fear. Why is that? You know that the ghost is not going to come out. You're in a theater with 100 other people. Your family is right next to you. Yet still, your body is in a fight or flight syndrome, right? In fact, when you watch a horror movie, you can't learn. You can't. Your reproductive organs shut down. You can't digest food. You can actually smell more. You can. You can't see it now. But if you have been an animal, for example, all your ears would have expanded more. Your heart rate is higher. Why is that? Is because of this two tracks. This one, that when fear comes in, your prefrontal cortex processes the fear, but it also goes to the amygdala. So while you're safe, but the amygdala forces you to feel fear. You really don't have a choice. Actually, when you watch a horror movie, you really don't have a choice to feel fear because amygdala has so much of control over you. And that's true of children who experience stress. When I say stress also includes things like husband and wife fighting at home, right? Bullying, social bullying, right? Somebody writes nasty things on Facebook about another child. All that is chronic stress for children. In fact, when children go through even 6 months of bullying, that's enough to be classified as chronic stress. That is actually enough to have significant damage in their, let alone psychological impact. That's a given. You have physical damage to their brains. So, what are some of the takeaways? Some of the takeaways are, first is mirror neurons. You see this image of an adult and a child. You actually see parts of the brain lighted. Again, it's a real image. We have something called mirror neurons. Even chimpanzees have this, by the way. What are mirror neurons? It's very interesting that when I have a certain emotion and certain parts of the brain are lighted up because of that emotion, and if I see another individual, another human, or even a dog for that matter, another mammal, the same parts of the brain light up. It's very interesting. So, for example, if I'm feeling stressful, I don't have to tell you anything. I just have to see you, and you see me, and there's probably a physical connect and there's a certain proximity. And if you do a scan of both our brains will have the same parts of brains light up. So, in some sense, emotions are transmits even without your free will, right? So you have to leverage that. So if child is very upset, you can, through your sheer excitement, positivity as a caregiver and educator, can light up those parts of the brain in another child. Another assessment of family. I think one of the critical parts of an educator's role is to see what kind of family children come from. What are the situations at home? It's just not be limited to math, physics, chemistry, or English, but also figuring out who are the parents okay. Are there fights at home? Are there job losses? Like during COVID, a lot of children experiences chronic stress in it. Third is being deliberate about relationships in schools and classrooms, right? I think William Daggett talks about this 3 hours for any deliberate learning to happen. He talks about relationship, relevance, and rigor. 3 things. We think of it as it's one of the most powerful frameworks for us to understand how learning happens. Relationship, relevance, rigor. And he says the first R is relationships, that you've got to establish safe relationship for any learning to happen. And that's what brain science also tells you. If your amygdala is not safe, you really can't do any learning. Learning is inconsequential for children whose amygdala is compromised. How do you do that in class schools? I think an advisory model is a very powerful model. We often underestimate the power of advisory, especially for adolescents who are actually going through stress. And often you don't know which adolescent is going through stress, right? Second is family engagement, involving families in the learning process. Another thing which I strongly recommend is meditation itself. I know it's controversial in some classroom contexts, but I don't see any other future in schools without the role of meditation and mindfulness practices in classroom. If we don't take the courage to practice and help children develop the capacity to meditate and be mindful, I don't know if you've done justice to their future. I'm going to quickly run through. I know we only have a few more minutes. I still have 3 more points to talk about. The third three takeaway which I want to talk about is goal orientation, which is brains respond very differently when they have a goal in mind. Not all information actually has the same impact on the brain, right? I'll give you a simple example before you go to this. Like, you might remember, hopefully, many of the things which I have talked about in this conversation, because you probably have a motivation to remember some things, right? But how many of you would actually remember the color of my kurta tomorrow morning? Right? Of course, now you'll remember because I've made you pay attention to it. But let's say if I hadn't asked this question and tomorrow I just call you, hey, do you remember what kurta I was wearing? Answer is no. It's not that your brain has not registered the information. Actually, the brain is actually capturing every piece of information, including my dress, my hair, my background, the plant, everything goes into your brain. It is getting formed as neurons. But when you sleep, during the dream stage, it chooses which neuron to keep, which neuron to kill. It cleans, right? Remember, every neuron consumes energy. 20% of what you breathe and what you eat goes to the brain. Brain is guzzler of energy. It is the biggest organ which requires maximum energy. In India, we are very conscious of mileage. Kitna deta hai. Brain actually takes a lot. It's a heavy duty engine. So it is also efficient. So what it does is, if it doesn't need a piece of information, it will kill it in the night. But if a piece of information is very important, if there is a goal which the brain thinks, it will keep it, reinforce it, wire it, and make connections so that it survives the next day morning. That's why good sleep is important for you to remember. We are natural explorers. The brain is a natural machine to learn, but it is always goal oriented. It has to know, why am I doing what am I doing? If it is not convinced, why am I doing what am I doing, it will kill that piece of information in the night. You will not remember it, right? So goal orientation also muscle in the prefrontal cortex, right? Goal orientation is also important for the brain because it's a great source of meaning and antidote to stress, right? A lot of times children feel stress, not because of stress per se or the experience, but because they don't know, why am I experiencing what am I experiencing? Like in a math class, some kids are, can put up with the stress. Why? Because they know that this stress is important for me to understand this concept better, right? Or in this physical sports, they stress themselves out, but they're still okay because there is a meaning to why am I playing in it. But in a math class, if the child has no reason or no meaning, why am I learning math? Then it doesn't work that way, right? So children will learn better. Their motivation is learn better if they know, why am I learning? What am I? Also, in a goal orientation, it also puts the amygdala and hippocampus in focus, right? The amygdala is taking a lot of negative information and all that stuff, but for it to focus that I'm going to learn here, it has to have a goal. So the takeaway for educators is, make goal orientation a habit in classrooms from day one, even early on. Even nursery kids can set goals. It's a myth that only adults do goals. No, actually, goal setting can't be taught to adults. In fact, that is why many of us in our generation actually are terrible at goal setting, terrible at new resolutions. Why? We do not set these things early on in our lives itself. So when children learn early on goal setting, they're better at it when they have this one. For a children, why is more important than what, right? I talked about William Daggett's 3 R's: relationship, relevance, and rigor. First is relationship. The second R he talked about relevance. that if a child knows why am I learning, what am I learning, they will learn much better, right? So you can't get into a unit or a concept just talking about the unit concept. You have to spend time. Why should you learn this concept? That is so important. In fact, I would say 15-20% of your entire unit time should actually go on figuring out with the children why should the child care to learn this concept. Second, also build rituals around goal setting. In classrooms, you can do every 15 days, every week, goals for the day, goals for the month, etc. Right. Third is sharing of assessment goals. Right. Creating rituals around sharing of assessment goals itself is very, very important, because when you share what your learning targets are, what the assessment goals are, then the neurons get ready for those. Remember, we talked about everything is a Velcro, that if I want to teach new things, it has to be based on past information. When you share learning targets, when you share assessment goals, rubrics ahead of time, there is some neuron network getting formed in the brain. And when the actual assessment happens, the student is able to use past memory, past neurons to work with it. So that's important. And finally, a very interesting concept called Pygmalion effect. I would strongly urge for you to Google and know more about it, because we really don't have much time. But Pygmalion effect is a very powerful concept where the brains, I mean, I don't know if it's a brain research or psychological research, but there is enough abundant research to tell you that it works, that children often rise up to the expectation adults set for the children. Repeating this, children often rise up to the expectation adults set for those children. When adults set high expectations, children will always rise up to it. When children set low expectations, children will prove you right by falling to those expectations, right? But what is interesting is you don't have to say these expectations to children. Whatever you believe, it will show in it. And there's research which has happened in schools in US, then when teachers set goals for their kids and they don't tell these goals to the kids, after a year you realize that the kids will actually prove the teachers right, that I have lived to this goal. The reason I'm sharing this is that have high expectations from students, and more often than not, the students will rise up to it, and that's what research tells us too. Next is sleep and stretch. One of the big takeaways, personally for me, is if you want healthy brains, if you want children to learn better, they have to do two things well, which is sleep well and exercise well, which often not talked about in Indian kids. Obesity, inactivity, and sleep deprivation are one of the biggest chronic killers. This is a complex framework, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But broadly, what I would like you to know is that every time you sleep, you have to sleep for 8 hours minimum. You can't have less than that, because in every time you sleep, each individual has to go through three cycles, and each cycle has 3 stages. Okay. Now, if you sleep less than 8 hours, you don't complete those 3 cycles, and you don't complete those 3 stages in each cycle. You get abrupt thing. Many times, what happens, and when you have compromised 3 cycles, your memory formation. I talked about REM sleep, where dreams happen and where memory actually gets coded. Actually, the brains are actually wiring neurons and establishing permanent long-term memories. All that is happening during dream state, and it has to happen 3 times. And if you don't if you don't have 8 hours of sleep, you're not going to have memory formation. In fact, in the long run, your capacity for memory goes down substantially if you don't sleep well. In fact, we have stress. If you don't sleep well and if you don't exercise well, dementia will hit in earlier. Remember, I talked about 3 aging phases. One is the young child, one is puberty, and third is old age. And I talked about old age, the brain starts winding down. Brain starts winding down for those people if they're very stressful all through their lives. Second, if they don't have habits of sleeping for 8 hours, those people actually have high incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's in it. And third, if they don't exercise regularly also, right? In fact, I should tell you, Alzheimer's and dementia is an increasing trend in our generation, and it is going to increase moving forward. The reason is that we have started to live longer compared to our previous generation. I think many of us would actually live on to 85, 90, etc. And you can manage the heart, you can manage your kidney problems, you can manage your spine problems, etc. You can't manage your brain problems, because Alzheimer's and dementia doesn't have any cure. Once it starts, it's just a matter of time. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? Uh, it so happens that most of us die of other things before dementia and Alzheimer hits it. But Alzheimer and dementia will hit it if you don't have sleep, if you don't manage stress, and if you don't exercise well all through your lives. And I should tell you, I really bless and wish that nobody has Alzheimer's and dementia. You rather leave this planet through something else, maybe a cancer or something. I know I'm sounding crude, but I've really thought through this for a long time. And there are interesting articles also on this. Like, for example, cancer is still a very reasonably good way to exit the planet because you have time to say goodbyes. It is painful, but it is a phased exit. Dementia and Alzheimer's there is no goodbyes in that sense, because you're still alive, but you just lose memory of what you know. You don't even recognize your loved ones. You won't recognize your spouse, your children. You'll feel so scared. When you see your daughter, son, or your spouse, when you have dementia, you know that you know them, but you don't know what. There's a deep feeling, but you don't know what. And you start thinking they are imposters. Well, that is very scary. And you leave this world very lonely. That can't happen. So I strongly urge that take sleep, take stress, take exercise very, very seriously if you want to avoid dementia and Alzheimer's. Treat sleep as the most important part of the day. Actually, for me, in my own personal life, after I've read enough research on this, for me, the most important part of the day is two things. When I sleep, and that half an hour when I go to bed is the most important part of the day. And when I wake up also, how you wake up makes a difference. But 7 to 8 hours in bed is supremely important. By the way, our brains are designed for a 3 p.m. nap around the world. It doesn't matter which part of the world you are in. Every human being in this planet has a circadian rhythm, and that circadian rhythm is designed for a 3 o'clock nap. If you're in a situation where you can take a 3 o'clock nap, please do, because that's what your brain sense tells you. You have to nap. By the way, I take a 15-minute, I do a shunya meditation, not an actual nap, but at 3 o'clock, I disappear wherever I am in this world. I will take, 3 is not exact, but it actually has profound impact on your creativity, profound impact on your logical thinking capacities, and your emotional health and well-being. 3 o'clock nap. Our forefathers used to do it. I strongly recommend you also start that practice of an afternoon nap. You don't have to do a 45-minute nap. A simple 20-minute snooze is more than enough, right? Lastly, what you do before sleep is very important. That's supremely important. It's not about 8 hours of sleep. It's about what you do in the 30 minutes before you go to bed. Because the brain actually should not think that you're awake when you're sleeping. Like you would have read these very obvious things. For example, you can't see screens because the blue code makes you think that you're still awake. It mimics sunlight. But that's the most obvious thing. Even other things like you can't eat food before you sleep. See, in those days, you used to eat food at 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock, you used to sleep. Now you have dinner at 9 and sleep at 10:30, 11. It doesn't work because you might be sleeping, but your brain is still active digesting the food. And that is why you don't get sleep, even if you spend 8, 9 hours on the bed, right? So some of those things, having a bath before you sleep, it's a very important thing. It brings your heart rate down, your cerebellum is down, your emotional frequencies are much lower. So you are in a mood to get to sleep. Small things, but goes a long way in your assessment. Stretching is very important. Exercise. In fact, I often say exercise is not for your body. It is not for you to keep thin. Your body is not in shape because of exercise. Nobody has lost weight because of exercise. I want to tell you this in the long run. In the long run, nobody loses weight because of exercise. You lose weight because of good eating habits. Food has a bigger role to play on your body weight than exercise does. But exercise is important, not for body weight, but for your brain's health. And of course, it keeps your metabolism high and all that stuff. But brain research tells you that for sharper brain, it's not solving Sudokus and, other crazy stuff, which is also important. But brain research tells you that if you exercise every day, your brain is really sharp, It will remember things. It will not have dementia, Alzheimer's. It will be very creative, etc. Because our brains, on an average, has evolved to do activities to walk 12 kilometers a day. Because remember, our brain still thinks we are in Africa, in the savanna grasslands of West Africa. Their average humans, about 75,000 years back, used to walk 12 kilometers a day on an average. So, but we're not walking today, and that's why the brain is not really in its best. But if you start walking 10,000 to 12,000 steps a day, you are helping the brain to be in its optimum level, right? There are startling cognitive effects if you do everyday exercise. And these are not heavy lifting exercise, simple exercise. I'll talk about what kind of exercise also, but it has startling cognitive effects, especially around executive functions, increased focus and spatial attention. A lot of kids have ADHD, they can't focus, they're always distracted. The best thing is get them to exercise, to walk around 12 kilometers a day. That's the only thing you can do. That's one of the effective things you can do. Third is better motor control and reaction speed, reduce attention disorder, language development. All of these things surprisingly has direct impact on exercise. How much and how long exercise? I would say aerobic exercise trumps anaerobic. Aerobic is anything is walking, swimming, brisk walking, not walking, brisk walking, swimming, anything which is running also is okay, but not anaerobic, not physical weightlifting. Right? That doesn't have an impact. In fact, I would argue that any brisk walking, see, passive walking is not effective at all. Like a lot of people just walk 40 minutes. It really doesn't have much impact, other than probably clearing your mind and taking some fresh air. That's also not there when you do it in a city like Delhi. But brisk walking, where your heart rate is above 80, 85 at least, then you have cognitive benefits to your brain. 30 to 45 minutes a day is more than enough. 5 times a week, 30 to 45 minutes of brisk walking. Okay. My mom does for 20 minutes. I often tell her that 20 minutes doesn't make any difference. Right? You've got to work at least for 30 minutes to be safe, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, right? Marathons are not healthy at all. I'm a marathon runner myself, but I also know there are other cardiovascular problems with marathons. Consistent movement is also helpful, right? Things like regular walking, like as you're speaking, as you're hearing this, can you keep moving your calf muscles, for example? Can you walk around and do meetings, for example? Can you walk around and take phone calls, for example? So this idea that I walk 10 kilometers in the morning, I do nothing the rest of the day is also not helpful at all. Even in classrooms, as teachers, can you help students move around? Because moving around actually improves oxygen and blood flow to the brain and increases memory retention. That's very, very important. My final big idea is building a second brain, which is that if you want to build a strong brain in us and in our children, you have to help people also build a second brain. What does a second brain mean? Second brain essentially means that do you have a schema in your notebook, in your laptop, or wherever, somewhere outside your head? Do you have a place to store all your information and schema? That's very, very important. In fact, great people who have great memory, great brain power are people who actually create a smaller brain in their notebooks or journals or in their digital portfolios. Okay, it's very surprising. People who attempt to keep everything in their brain actually are not great thinkers. Effective thinkers, effective creative innovators, etc., always have something called the second brain. Right? This is a very, what does it mean in the classroom? It is about understanding the different types of learning. Like, when you give information to children, you can actually have uses of data, it can be information, it can be knowledge, it can be insight, it can be wisdom. Our idea is to reach at least the last three columns, which is knowledge, insight, wisdom. And how does that happen? You make it happen through simple pedagogical tools, like, for example, helping children do mind maps early on in their lives. That's a very important skill in itself. Comparing and contrast, again, a very powerful assessment tool and also pedagogical. Comparing and contrast. Summarize and synthesize. How do I help children to summarize and synthesize? When you teach a concept, can you get children to, or a group of children to just summarize and synthesize? Again, that's another way to help them create separate schemas. Translate another form that let's say you hear a PowerPoint or a textbook, can you ask them to write a research paper out of it? Or you read a research paper, can you ask them to make a PowerPoint out of it? More importantly, portfolios. Again, a very powerful tool, which most Indian schools don't follow, but it's a low-hanging fruit. Of course, there's a lot of work you need to do with the teaching community to do that. But once the portfolio happens, it helps children to be systemic about their knowledge information. Right. So these are the 5 things I talked about. I talked about emotions. I talked about constructing knowledge. I talked about sleep and stress. I talked about managing schemas, and also talked about how memory is formed also. So those are my 5 big ideas. Uh, there's one last thing which I think all of us need to keep in mind, especially in today's age and time of information overload. Something which brain research also tells you. This is something which I've also learned from one of the spiritual masters who I follow and had the fortune to meet. And when I met him, one of the things he said is, sorry, he said is, we live in a kind of universe that yields only when we pay attention. We live in a kind of universe that yields only when we pay attention. And I found it so relevant to brain science also, that when, as children, when they learn, the problem is that you can't learn without paying attention. You can't learn without being mindful and being there. Overload of information is not the way to learn. In fact, doing deep work is what is the best gift you could give to children to learn, right? In fact, I wrongly recommend all educators read this book by Carl Newport called Deep Work, where in a world which is so distracted and there's so much of information overload, for children to really learn and be masters for life and master learners for life, you have to give them the gift of deep work, right? With this, I end my session. I invite you to follow me on Twitter. I do share a lot of interesting articles around brain science, again, education pedagogy on Twitter. In fact, as educators, I strongly recommend you should be on Twitter. It's one of the best learning platforms I've ever come across. Looking forward to connecting with you. For those of you who have stayed back till the end of the session, thank you so much. But I have promised you that I will share you one tidbit about Gajini in itself. Some of you would wonder, is Gajini a real life story or not? Of course, it's not a real life story. It's a Bollywood movie. But there was one gentleman called Penis Garage. His name is, the medical word calls him PG, but his name is Phineas Garage. He was in the US in the late 19th century, 1830, 1840. He actually had met with an accident where his hippocampus was damaged. You can actually see his real picture, and it's a drawing of his skull when he was actually working in laying railroads, rail tracks. And to rail track, they normally used to put dynamite, I'm sorry, not granite, dynamite into the granite rocks, and it explodes to make way to put the tracks. And one of the explosions, it became an accident where a rod which was lying next to the dynamite bursted out, and it came flying and hit him in his eye, and it pierced his skull and came out. Surprisingly, he was alive. The rod came out and alive, but doctors back then had no clue about what it did to his brain. Okay. And in the surgery, the doctor by design just removed the hippocampus. Okay, because he thought it's damaged. He didn't know what the hippocampus was. He just removed it. And Phineas Garage was alive for about 15 years after this accident, but he just couldn't remember many things, like Gajini did. So thank you so much. I just thought I'll share with you this tidbit. All that we know about the brain is actually because some poor souls like PG here have paid dearly with their lives, and they're all subjects of brain research. In fact, everything we know about prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, etc., somebody had actually had a brain damage, and doctors had to experiment through their painful lives, and that's how we know much about the brain the way we do, right? Thank you so much, Jayashree. Over to you if there's any questions.
Thank you, Vishnu. Really insightful. But yeah, we have a couple of minutes more, and there are a few questions. So Priyanka asks, can you please recommend some books for educators to understand this concept that you have discussed? So is it Deep Work by Carl Newport? Is there any other book? Or
yeah, Deep Work by Carl Newport is just about habits we can build in our lives and our children's life, about focusing. A lot of the work around brain is just about, if you're more distracted, for example, there's enough research. For example, colors, for example, has a very deep impact on how distracted you could get. So there's one book I would recommend. But if you want to understand basics of cognitive neuroscience, there is a book called Mind Brain Education. I'll probably send a link to you, Jay. You can send it to the participants
Sure.
via email. There's also another book called Brain Rules.
Okay.
If you don't want a heavy science book, but you want a science, we call it science fiction. No, it's not fiction. It's called science pop fiction book, which is essentially easy reads based on some research. This book called Brain Rules. Again, there are 9 rules which this book talks about. I found it very, very interesting. I would strongly recommend you read that book as well.
Yeah, okay. Then there is another question from Hasina Sultana. She asked about phobias that human beings have. Many of us have phobias. So what is that? How is that related to brain functioning? Yeah.
See, a few things, I mean, of course, it's a very broad question, phobias. I would clarify, but some of these phobias come from different things. So some phobias, for example, are very genetic. Like, for example, our phobia for fire is hardwired. It's there in the reptilian brain. It's not there in the mammalian or the prefrontal cortex. It's there in the reptilian brain because that's a way to keep, like a fear for snakes, for example. It's passed on through your DNA. It's not a social construct. You don't need to teach a child whether the snake is safe or not. Children will have certain fears for certain things without being tutored or taught, right? So there are some fears that are genetic. In fact, many, like for example, people would argue that even if somebody goes through, and if our forefathers have gone through experience of a famine, 4 or 5 generations later, the younger generation remembers it because those fears were passed on through genes also. So karma, I mean, in our Eastern tradition, we talk about karma, our allegiance to our forefathers. You know, we do a lot of these rituals to actually pay obeisance or gratitude or even closing or sorting out karma to our forefathers. Why? Because a lot of what we experience is actually passed on from generation to generations in it. So there are certain phobias that way. A lot of the phobias in our practical world also comes from our early experiences. I talked about age 6, like if a mother is fearful, I know a lot of experienced educators would know this. And there's brain research which tells you there are actually neuroscience scans which can tell you when mother experiences stress, that stress passes on to children, even to the adult life. Even worse and scary, it not just passes on adult life, it actually passes on to that individual as a mother also. In some ways, parenting is, I know I'm not trying to get the fathers away out of it, but biologically, parenting is genetic.
Yeah.
The parenting style we have experienced,
Yeah.
specifically caregivers and mothers, actually pass on when we are caregivers and mothers to women, right? Some of these phobias also pass on to those things. And that's why I always say parenting is a very sacred thing because you not only impact your children, you impact your grandchildren.
Yeah.
So phobias have a big role to play, and some of these networks do get hardwired. But good news is, brain is plastic. You can, through better experiences, or so you can't kill existing neurons. I want you to know this too. If a neuron network is there, you really can't kill it unless you create an alternative neuron and pay more attention to the alternative neuron. And with the hope that the old neuron networks of fear, of conditioning die out. That is why changing habits is very difficult when you grow old. Like drinking coffee, I'm a South Indian, so drinking coffee is such a strong thing. There is an impulsive thing because my neural networks of coffee are so strong in the morning. To kill that habit, the only way is I have to find an alternative neuron network for my morning ritual. With the hope that the morning ritual for alternates gets stronger and stronger, and the coffee neuron it will die out if I have the willpower to fight it too. So yeah, phobias are real, but you can overcome these through alternative networks, which brain can develop at any age, any point in time.
Yeah, thank you. So we have one last question. If any, is there anything from anybody? You can unmute. You can ask Vishnu before we sign off.
So I wanted to check with you, Vishnu. That there are these, you spoke about this session and you gave a couple of examples as to how we can take this to classrooms. But classrooms in heritage are very different from classrooms all over, right? So how can I take all of this session to a government school where, I mean, when you speak about the development of the brain, but that itself is not at the same level.
Yeah.
So
See, yeah. So of course, I can't give a 2-minute answer to such an important and a profound question, because the interventions in a government school, again, in a government school, there's a wide variance also. But let's say I would imagine a government school in an Indian context where resources are poor, training is poor, etc. In a government context, I think the primary thing for health of a child's brain, primary thing is two things. One is nutrition. You got to get the nutrition right in the first place. I hope you know 50% of Indian children are physically stunted. Physically stunted. I mean, forget about brain and all that. Even the heights are shorter. In fact, most Indians in the rural parts, for example, even among people who work with us as buyas and DVs, or drivers, or security guards, people who come from an impoverished, unfortunate socioeconomic background, you'll find them they're shorter, because that's proven now that nutrition has been compromised, and hence their growth is stunted. When physical growth is stunted, so is the brain growth is stunted. So the first thing in a government school context is nutrition. Second is emotional safety, right? You really want to provide an atmosphere of abundance in it. And this is not rocket science. It's not about resources. It's not about this. It's about a mindset. In fact, a lot of the, like you go to the US, which also has poverty in the public schools, one of the primary focus is actually emotional safety. That if they come from homes which are broken, single mothers, there are violence there, etc. And many Indian families also go through those things. You'd want to provide emotional safety, at least in the classroom, right? It can go a long way to ensure that the amygdala doesn't get permanently impaired. It doesn't ensure that the hippocampus doesn't get permanently smaller in it, because a smaller hippocampus means you really can't learn even into your adult life, right? So those are some of the things which we could do. The third thing which I would also do in a government school context is that you do things which is natural for the brain to learn, which doesn't require a lot of this. What are these? Language. I'm not talking about literacy. Language. Language is easily learned. You don't actually need adults for children to learn languages. You just need to immerse them, because brains are natural language learners. Second thing is music. Like introducing music. It's not, when I say music, I'm not talking about instruments, but the world of musical appreciation itself. Even if they don't learn an instrument later, but if they're exposed to a certain form of music appreciation, it goes a long way for them to pick it up in the adult life when they have resources. So those are some of the things which you could do, which the brain, social boundaries, right? The brain needs to be taught how do I negotiate my boundaries? How do I negotiate my contracts socially without abusing, hitting, being courteous, a lot of these things. And those are best taught before age 6. Another book I strongly recommend is Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life. He's a controversial psychologist based out of Canada, but he's written this wonderful book called 12 Rules of Life. In fact, there's one chapter on parenting. And he talks about how there is a very small window for children's brain to learn social negotiations. And often educators and parents squander that window. And hence you have bullies, you have people who are selfish, who are greedy, even in the adult life, insecure, for example. So some of those things can be taught early on, because brain is waiting for these things to be taught.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really informative and insightful, Vishnu. And I think to sum it all up, I think, just like how you expect a cardiologist to know all about the heart, I think as educators, if we want our children to learn, we need to know all about the brain, right? So the first step is to have an awareness of how the brain develops, and then kind of go, take those small little steps, which we will be able to do, whether it is a government school or whether, it is any other kind of school, whatever, depending on, where our students come from. So I think that is what it is. And thank you to everybody for joining us and, being a part of this community. And I really hope this was helpful, and hoping to see you again in our next community of practice, which is the next month. And just for information, so we will also be starting with a lot of our professional development workshops in the coming month. And please, reach out to us if you want anything. So we would love to know what are the topics that you would want us to create workshops on. So please look out for posts on the social media on the upcoming professional development workshops.
Jay, I also put the link of the book, The Brain Rules. You get this in India also, although I put the link of the US, but you can, I know Amazon India also delivers this at a much cheaper price. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, folks. Thank you, Jay, for having me here, and hope to.
Thank you, Vishnu, for joining us. Vishnu has been very busy. Thank you. Really kind of you to take out time and come and be with us on this platform. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.